For me, as a pediatrician, when something's killing children, when something's the number one killer of children, I feel that it's important that people know about it. And I feel like it's something that we address. Children aren't supposed to die. Our job as doctors is to prevent it. And as parents, right, we work with parents, we work with families, we work across sectors to protect children. And I think that's a place where we can all agree no child should die from gun violence. It's something completely preventable.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to the Pursuit of Health podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Fethke, and we have the privilege of today of sitting back and really focusing on a topic that affects each and every one of us in the United States. That's the issue of gun violence. It's come up again in a way that has really consolidated everyone's attention this past summer into the fall. And today we're going to focus specifically on its impact in children. And to do so, we are fortunate to have someone who's spent a big part of her career working on this issue and really can enlighten us on this topic, which I think is vitally important. That's Dr. Nina Agrawal. And welcome, Dr. Agrawal, to the Pursuit of Health podcast.
Thank you for having me, Eric.
Thank you. And what I'd like to do, just to share again, as with many of our guests, their accomplishments and their work could fill a whole hour of discussion alone. Very impressive and very fortunate to have someone like you working on this. But to introduce our audience to Dr. Agrawal, she obtained her medical degree at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and then went on to New York University in Cornell Medical Center in New York for her pediatric internship and residency. But then she took a focus, which we'll talk about more, specifically as a fellowship in child abuse pediatrics at NYU, and then further work and a fellowship at the Richard Nathan Policy Fellow as fellow in red flag laws in minors at the Rockefeller Institute, also in New York. She's now pursuing her master's of public health and health communications for social change at City University, and is currently the director and founder of Child Health Solutions, also based in New York. She has spent a lot of her career working on child abuse, sexual assault and violence, again based in New York, in the Bronx, and many parts of our state. And we're very fortunate to have her be here in New York to do so. In the past, she's worked, and I think this is the most important thing to me, she is still a practicing pediatrician, and I think that's very important. Boots on the ground, as I say, really gives us all an insight that as we do and discuss about policy issues such as this, to have someone who is right there on the front lines, I think is very important. She's been a recipient of many grant awards, has published and spoken in public and been invited as a speaker in many forums. And we are very fortunate to have Dr. Nina Agrawal join us today to discuss this issue of gun violence and its impact on children. So thank you again. And I'd really like to open up so you can tell the audience yourself a little bit about your background. How did a pediatrician get involved in issues regarding gun violence?
Well, it's a great question, Eric, and it's an important story for me to tell. And I remember to the day, it was December 14th, 2012. This was 11 years ago. And that day was the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School. And every time I talk about it, honestly, I get teary-eyed. I did not know anybody, but as a pediatrician, it really affected me. And
Yeah, it was
the
one of
day that
those
it,
moments in our lives, where we all kind of say, do you remember where you were that day? It was one of those events. Absolutely.
it's exactly that. I remember it, like seeing it on the television set and, seeing the ticker on the bottom and was like, oh my God. And, well, now I'm not sure I would be as surprised, but then I was really shocked. And I live in New York City, and I went to Candlelight Vigil in Union Square, New York City. And I just took a vow to myself that I would do everything I could to prevent something like this from happening again. And I linked up with physicians, fellow physicians, through an organization called Doctors for America. And I had
Mm.
worked with them on advocating for healthcare reform, actually. And it was actually, this organization was founded by our current Surgeon General. And I ran a campaign to raise awareness about the Dickey Amendment.
And we'll talk more about that definitely. And again, those I think everyone at some point in their career can look back to either a personal interaction or an event that changes the course of our lives, the journey, as we call it, of our professions and our lives. And I think you're right. Here we are talking about this uh, over a decade later, and it really is a question like, why wasn't that? I think that's a good point to take off on our conversation, because why wasn't that the breaking point? Children are now being impacted by this. That's got to be it. Everybody's like, okay, here we go. We're going to make some major changes. We're going to improve things. It's children now. This is the line we've crossed. But it doesn't seem like that happened. And why is that? Why is it that, you know, we haven't crossed? I think we need to talk about that. But you've taken the approach, you and your colleagues, to say, well, maybe one of the ways we can do this advocacy work as doctors is through evidence-based research. So how have you approached this issue from that day?
Well, I educated myself as doctors, right? We read, we educate ourselves, we talk to people, we learn, and then we decide what we're going to do our next course of action. So that's what I did. I educated myself and I educated doctors across the country. And then what we decide is what is within our scope. There's a lot that can be done, but what's within our scope as health providers? And I learned about the lack of research in this area,
Mm.
and I educated people on what we can talk about an hour later, the Dickey Amendment, and basically raised awareness about it. And I feel like part of it's like versus educating before doing something. And we often hear this clamoring, like, do something. But in medicine, when do we ever do that? When do we ever say, like, when somebody has cancer, just do something? No, we learn, we do research, we provide data, and we make an informed treatment plan, whether it be prevent disease or injury. And firearm related injuries is no different.
Mm. And I think that's a very important point, that as clinicians, but also as lay people, there's some sweat equity up front. Part of what we're trying to do here at the podcast, and you and I talked about this, is that the audience is broad. We don't want to exclude anyone. We want to invite people into this process of learning and researching. That's what we're doing here now, talking to people about this background so that they can hopefully then become advocates of their own at their level. And that's why we're so happy to have guests like you here. But that's a very valid point. The first thing you do is what we're doing. Learn, be familiar, become somewhat of an expert of your own, and then take it to what's relevant for you and your community. And I think that's very important. And what did you learn about, in terms of the 1990s work that was starting to go? There already had been a groundwork laid before that event. Dr. Kellerman in 1993 in the New England Journal, was starting to do this. So you've got almost a decade earlier, people had started doing evidence-based research, but what did you learn had happened after that publication in 1993, which I think is a turning point?
It definitely was a turning point, that New England Journal medicine paper by Kellerman. And it's when politics influenced policy. And
Mm.
it's when it, contributed to loss of lives, basically. But, you see it as a problem, but there's also a solution to it, right? A counter
Mm.
solution. So, is that insurmountable? No, it's not. And, it was something buried, though. I think people did not know about it. This
Mm.
so what I learned was that around 1994 there was a paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine that found that if you had a firearm in your home, you or somebody else in your home are more likely to be injured or die from that firearm than protect yourself from somebody coming from the outside.
Right.
So the myth that you need a firearm to keep you safe from an intruder wasn't backed by science. It wasn't backed by the data. And when that article came out, the NRA, the National Rifle Administration, was not happy with that data because it would mean less gun sales. It would mean less money to the firearm industry. And they advocated to Representative Dickey of Arkansas to pass what's called the Dickey Amendment.
And
And
he was a senator, or a senator at that time.
he's a representative, so he was a
Right, right.
congressman. And so in 1996, the Dickey Amendment went through. And what
Mhm.
that said is that no funds could be used by the CDC to promote or advocate for gun control. And so that's sort of a loaded statement. And so no funds could be used to advocate or promote gun control. So advocate or promote, is that what research does? And
Mhm.
is it gun control? And I feel when we say gun control, it politicizes the issue.
Right.
That article was doing in New England Journal of Medicine was not gun control. It was, how do we keep people safe? We're not saying to ban guns. We're not saying to take away guns. We have guns just like we have cars. We didn't ban them. How do we make them safer for people?
Right.
And so that's what that article was saying. And because the Dickey Amendment went through, the CDC was what we call defunded. They had roughly a little over $2 million to study gun violence. And that funding was earmarked for gun violence research. And the way the CDC operates, the money has to be earmarked. They don't get this general pot of money. And so that money they said, well, you can use that for concussions. You can't use that anymore for gun violence. So they lost all funding. And what that created was what we call a chilling effect on the entire research community. Research dollars are hard to come by, and everybody was
Mhm.
worried they would similarly lose funding. And it did. It did get extended to the NIH, the Dickey Amendment. So a study came out actually out of Mount Sinai that in relationship to the mortality rate for gun violence, like the amount of research dollars are minuscule. So research plummeted after the passage of the Dickey Amendment, and with that, solutions.
So essentially, we're taking the lesson learned, all the sweat equity research behind all this, as you're looking into this then, and the work you do now is people like you, pediatricians, physicians, Dr. Kellerman, and some of the people you've worked with, Dr. Brandis at Columbia, even 2 years earlier before the Sandy Hook event, 2009, is connecting in the literature gun possession and gun assaults, and that association. And you're saying, okay, wait a second, this is a health issue. We're going to focus on this as a public health issue and a real health issue. And so we're going to look back into that. And the moment we do that and look at it purely as an evidence-based health issue, we overlap into politics and policy, because the funds that come for this come from our tax dollars through CDC, NIH, and therein lies those who might have some concern about what the evidence is showing. They use that mechanism to essentially put a rider on another bill. It wasn't like a main bill or something. It was just a rider, the Dickey Act, if I understand it, that said, don't want you to use our tax dollars to cut our business off, so to speak, and affect us economically, the NRA is saying, and people who sell guns and own guns. And you're saying, but that's not what we were trying to do. We were just trying to say, what is going on? Let's get a sense of that. Let's at the impact, and let's try to make it safe, as you said, with the analogy of cars. But we spent the next 20 some years handcuffed to be able to continue the work that Kellerman and others had done. And, we'll talk about the future now, but how that's kind of opened up a little bit lately. So if we're talking about this topic and as we're doing our background research, what's the scope of the problem we're dealing with here? I think we hear about it all the time, but I think some of the relevant data or the sense of how big a problem is gun violence, and particularly the impacts on children and women, as pediatrician, focusing on that. Give us a sense, our audience, what are we dealing with here? Why is this important to be focusing on this? Is this a minor issue that we hear a lot about, or is this a big problem?
Right. Well, great question. For me, as a pediatrician, when something's killing children, when something's the number one killer of children, I
Mm,
feel that it's important that people know about it. And I feel like it's something that we address. Children aren't supposed to die. That's just our job as doctors to prevent it. And as parents, right, we work with parents, we work with families, we work, like what we talked about, across sectors to protect children. And I think that's a place where we can all agree no child should die from gun violence. It's something
mm.
completely preventable. So, what can each of us do, like, as professions and together to prevent it? And I think that's where I feel like I've been working, in healthcare and across sectors with community organizations and mothers groups to try and find solutions.
Gotcha. And I think, we say that sometimes we get so involved in our own fields, and hopefully our audience will as well, becoming experts of their own. But you made a comment which I don't think most people realize. It's the number one cause of death in children. So if pediatricians and doctors are supposed to be involved in anything, this makes perfect sense why physicians should be involved and clinicians in general who work with children. The number one cause of death. To not be working in this area as a pediatrician would almost sound like neglect. We have to be working in this. It's not some minor cause. It's the number one cause of death in the United States specifically. We're watching, 49,000 people die a year in the United States in 2021, up from 45,000. We're just going up, up, up in 2020. And it's killing children more than anything else. It's affecting women in terms of domestic violence more than anything else, which of course is going to affect their children, if children are involved. So yeah, it's a huge topic, and particularly American topic, with more than 5 times the number of deaths in the United States compared to the next country, which is France or Canada. So it's a big problem. So what are the things you've learned so far? What is your research showing you as the major factors in gun violence, and how they affect children? Share that a little bit with us. What are some of the things that research, though handcuffed and opening up again a little bit more since 2012, has loosened the reins a little bit in 2018 on some of the way we saw the Dickey Act and impact us? People are starting to go back and work like you. What have we learned? What are some of the things our audience should know about this evidence-based research and the impact on children?
Yeah, what we have learned, one is the data. We need to start, what are the numbers? Like, how many kids
Mm,
are affected? And so what we know is that, we trend the data, gun violence has been creeping up in children since 2016. This is not something new. It's been creeping up. And then it reached number one in 2020, and it's been persistent in 2021. So this problem is still there. And what we know is that gun sales also spiked in 2020. That's not a coincidence. The more guns out there in circulation that are unsecure, the more children have died. What we also know is that in what we talked about is that after the Parkland shooting, the youth spoke and trauma surgeons spoke, and the NRA said to the doctors, hey, this is your lane. This isn't your lane. And the doctors showed their blood-soaked scrubs on Twitter, and they're like, no, this is our lane. We don't want to be fixing bullet
mm,
wounds. We don't want to tell parents that, your kid's not coming home. We want to prevent this from happening. So when the youth and doctors and mothers spoke, finally, Congress appropriated money for gun violence research.
mm,
And in the past few years, I've seen an explosion in research. So we have a lot more data. We have a lot more evidence to back solutions. Do we need more? Yes, we definitely need more. But we have enough to move forward. I think the challenge is moving this research that now we have so much more like evidence for solutions. It needs to be translated to policies and
Mm.
legislation and practice in doctors' offices. And it needs to be a public awareness campaign to parents. Like the CDC hasn't come out and said it's the number one killer. It's coming from these research sources, but this needs to go on a national, on a federal level, so that we can all be part of the solution.
So essentially, the 5 years ago, roughly the handcuffs. People say, "Well, we didn't mean the Dickey Amendment to be so strict. It's okay. You can start looking again and doing some research. We'll not make the NIH or the CDC feel so, handcuffed to not wanting to access funds for this. Go ahead, apply, do some research. We'll open that gate a little bit more." And as we do so, it's public, basically, sentiment that's pushing that, as you said. And again, physicians and parents, it gets to the point where it boils over, which is what a democracy is supposed to do, right? Say, wait a second, this is a topic, this is important to us. And I think what you said is very important. Many times we hear the pandemic did this in many ways. People would say, "Doctor, I'm the politician, you're the doctor. You do what you do, I'll do what I do. Stay out of my lane." I think that's impossible in topics like this. That's almost disrespectful. We all have a stake. We all bring something to this. There is no silo. I do my thing, you do thing. When it's like this, we've got to all work together and bring everything we have to a problem like this. I mean, I think that's what your work, and that I've read your work and others doing, is saying, no, it is our lane. It does belong in the medical realm, or at least we have a huge amount to contribute to this solution.
Yeah, and I do want to say that there is no one solution. There is no
Right.
one silver bullet, as we would say. And what I'm learning is that there are different types of gun violence, and it matters where you live. It matters, your socioeconomic status, just like any other disease, right? Like diabetes, it matters where, a lot of these, what we call social determinants of health, influence, the type of injury or disease you're going to experience. So within gun violence, it's not a monolith. There's suicide, there's homicide, there's unintentional injury, there's police induced. There are innocent bystanders, kids that are caught in crossfire, which are not currently counted by the CDC separately. And then there's the exposure element. When children are exposed to gun violence, and that's been an interest of mine as a child abuse pediatrician, like I've been interested in how exposure to domestic violence and other adversities in children's lives affects their health. And what
Mm.
we know is that when children are abused or neglected, it can lead to long-term health problems in adulthood. Heart disease, heart attack, stroke, cancer, fractures. So all these things that we think of as chronic health problems in adulthood, there's risk in early childhood. And what we're learning more and more is, before age 5, that before children can walk and talk, the violence that they're experiencing affects their health, affects their
Mm.
immune systems, affects their brains. And we need to start out early,
Mm.
on preventing violence. And I believe in preventing exposure to gun violence as well.
And I think your analogy of the car safety issue is very apropos. I mean, the idea that, depending on your roads, your neighborhood, your community, the what happens with your cars may be different than in a city or a town or a small town. So it's very much intrinsic to the makeup of the United States. I don't want to, say we have our own makeup, and that makeup creates our own problems. And, it is the data, from what I understand, shows clearly it's the number of guns it correlates every time with the level. But then when you go down and do a little bit more in the weeds and really look down in the details, and as you said, it's multifactorial. It's very specific to the socioeconomic or environmental status of where people live. But I think that other aspect of what are the downstream effects of this and the costs of that are very important, both economic and health wise. what are we learning? I was looking at some of your publications and articles and blogs about, op-eds about the impacts on children. If you would share that, what is an effect in the article you recently did about the effects on girls in communities? What kind of stuff are you seeing?
Right. So, how I became interested in this, the exposure element and
Mm,
how it's impacting children's health, was when I was working as a pediatrician in the South Bronx. And I remember seeing a 5-year-old, and she came in for maybe some exposure to domestic violence. And then, we always ask about sleeping and eating, basic stuff. And she couldn't sleep. And I was like, well, why can't you sleep? And she said, basically because she was hearing gunshots outside her window. And I was like, well, what do you do? And she's, well, I just get a snack and I go back to sleep. And she had a very like sad affect. She definitely, she was not this happy-go-lucky child. And so what I realized that we've been focusing on violence in children's homes, and we've made progress there, and saying that that's not healthy for children. But we have not thought about violence outside their homes, and we've created this silo effect. There's home, there's school, and then there's community. But children live
mm.
in all of these places. And how do they all come together to affect children's health? And I remember seeing another child who was having palpitations. She felt like her heart was racing, and she'd been to the ER. She had been to the cardiologist. Nothing was wrong. And then I found out she had come from El Salvador, and she was now living in the Bronx, and she was experiencing PTSD.
Yes.
She was being triggered. She had had like 10 family members shot in El Salvador. But again, it's like, we have to think about like the root cause, I think, of what, children's health symptoms, so whether they're coming with headaches, abdominal pain, where is that? What's the root cause of that? And we need to think about how violence is affecting them. So I
I,
linked.
and I, yeah, go ahead.
So I linked up with a researcher at Columbia, and we published the first paper on the need to classify exposure to gun violence as an adverse childhood experience. And in doing
Hmm.
so, we can like identify it, we can quantify it, and we can address it and perhaps mitigate risk of victimization and perpetration later in adulthood.
It's very important to realize. I mean, you hit a chord with me when you talked about the palpitations as a pediatric cardiologist, because the number of patients that have come to us all lately as pediatric cardiologists with anxiety-related symptoms, chest pain, palpitations, dizziness, fainting, and then you're adding the, basically the refugee component to it. Which is America again, a lot of countries here, but how do we deal with refugees and where are they running from and where do they go? They don't necessarily come to, a bucolic area in the United States. They're coming into the cities, and here we go, and we have more violence and the impact of that. And the downstream effects, essentially seeing this anxiety. Time this week magazine, the whole article, the whole cover is about what's it like to grow up as a child in the United States today. And the gun issue is very, very important. And I think your work is starting to filter through, the lay literature, so to speak. We all know it, but sometimes I think we feel overwhelmed by it and don't know quite what to do. It's like, okay, we got it, but now what? We hear you now. And I think that was a big important part of the work, to have people listen, policymakers or others. But, what do we do and why it's important to do so? And what you also touched on was the issue essentially of mental health, the impacts on the mental health of our children. We talk about mental health as a cause of gun violence in the United States, and people push that out there. But you're saying, wait, but there is a consequence that's an effect, a mental health effect or impact of gun violence as well. It's both sides of that coin. And could you tell us a little bit about what you feel that issue is of mental health as a cause that you're seeing of gun violence? People say, well, if we deal with mental health, we'll answer a lot of the problems of gun violence. That's what people are saying. Is that true? What's your sense of that? And on the flip side, what kind of mental health problems are we creating because of gun violence in our children?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up. It's probably the biggest myth out there,
Yeah.
is that mental health is the root cause of gun violence, and we need to make a distinction. There are a lot of people with mental health problems out in the United States. Depression, anxiety. Are they, do they have a higher risk of perpetrating a mass shooting or being shot?
Mm.
Not necessarily. So we need to make a distinction between mental health and risk of violence. What makes somebody at higher risk of violence? We need to understand that for sure. But saying that a child has ADHD or autism or depression, that is not the focus of what makes a child at risk for violence, whether being a victim or a perpetrator.
And some of your research is debunking sort of this myth. I mean, that's how you're doing it. You're saying, we're going to look at this issue and we're not going to dismiss this. We're going to look, is that the issue? And you're saying, no, from what we're learning, that's not how this is working. Mental health issues are not creating gun violence in children.
Well, I guess it may have contributed to it. I think it's that, again, it's that, well, we just have to fix the mental health system, and that's it. That's the
Mm.
answer. And it's almost like, well, we can't do anything, and it becomes this like sort of scapegoat
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
not doing anything.
Yeah. It's kind of our excuse for why, where despair comes in. Well, there's nothing we can do, throw up our hands, unless somebody can solve that problem. And you're saying, no, let's look at evidence and what's contributing to the whole dynamic here, not just one factor. So the point is making starting early in children is a logical approach to the root cause way of dealing with things. Start young.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And, when I do gun violence work, and when I give talks, I often bring up cases that people know about. And I think it's really
Mm.
important that we understand it by what's happening, right? This is not something in the abstract. And so in New York, as you know, last year, there was a mass shooting committed by or perpetrated by an 18-year-old at that time. And he killed 10 people in a grocery store. And he was 17 when he came to the attention of the schools. People asked him, "What do you want to do when you finish school?" And he said, "Suicide, homicide." And he came to the attention of law enforcement in the school and had some type of mental health evaluation, but then fell off. And then when he did turn 18, he bought a firearm and perpetrated a shooting. So he himself is a youth, right? He himself was in that school
Mm.
system. He had parents, he had teachers, he had mental health people. Like, these are all the people, I think, that, what can we do to avert that, a child basically, from perpetrating a mass shooting?
Right. And again, we all understand from our background, don't need to be a clinician to know that many problems that adults have mental health wise begin in childhood. And, that's the foundation of Jung and Freud's whole teaching, right? I mean, that hasn't changed. And the impacts on how that eventually manifests begin early. So, are there any lessons we've learned from our research or going across the pond to other countries in terms of, as we said, everybody has mental health issues of some type, maybe intrinsic to their own country, but have we learned about their level of gun violence or how they deal with it in children? Is it different? Are we learning anything from that, or is there any work going on to actually do some of this work cross nationally, internationally?
Well, we know that gun violence is a uniquely American phenomenon, and
Mm.
we also know that the U.S. Has a lot of guns.
Yeah.
There are a lot of guns in circulation that are unsecure, and other large wealthy countries have much less gun violence and many less firearms. So more
But
guns
they
is
may
not
still have they may still have the same mental health and other social issues, though.
right. Right.
So
Exactly.
interesting. So that the outcomes are less. Because one thing that struck me recently, and I think it was somewhere in Eastern Europe when they had a shooting, they immediately made a policy, and nobody had any questions. Drop your guns, bring them in. and they just couldn't imagine how many people just dropped their guns. It wasn't a discussion. There was no debate. They just looked, and somebody said to the person watching the guns there in that room that was filling up with guns, how come this is happening so quickly? Why did people just do that? And they said everybody agreed it was important.
Right, exactly. And that speaks to what public health is, right? Public health is not blaming the individual for their behavior or trying to change that individual's behavior. It's like, I like this analogy, when a flower isn't growing, you don't change out the flower, you change out the soil that the child is growing
Right.
in, right? So you think about the environment that's been created, the violent environment, the risks, the access to firearms, all of these factors. And that's what public health does. It thinks about the environment and how can we make everybody safer.
Hmm.
And that's what other countries have done. And that's what we can do. We've done it before with car accidents. We've saved children from dying in car accidents with seatbelts and airbags and drunk driving laws and so many legislative changes, as well as cultural changes.
Right.
It's not cool to drink and drive, right? You take away somebody's keys. Similarly, you should not have a gun if you have a risk of violence either, or if you've been drinking. So it has been done in other countries. It has been done in the U.S., and we can do
Yeah.
that for firearms.
And you're right. The analogy is there. Or in pediatrics, we're constantly doing safety recommendations regarding how infants sleep, or products a child is using, or car seats, or anything. And we have no problem with that. We all jump up there, and it goes back to that initial point that turned your head in that direction in your heart, which is children. Okay, wow, this has really now gotten into Sandy Hook, and it's children, and this is the turning point. And somehow there's still resistance, not resistance to the cars, not resistance to the car seat tests, or the formulas we might feed our children, which are nowhere near the scope of impact and death that gun violence is. But we're still finding resistance to this gun violence issue. What are the major areas of resistance that you're seeing when you're just trying to deal with gun safety?
Right. Well, you hit the mark there by saying gun safety. We don't say sleep control, car control, highway control. It's talking about injury prevention. We're talking about safety. And, some progress we've seen is that under the current administration, there's been a creation of the Office of Gun Violence Prevention.
Right.
And that is huge progress. One is the federal government is recognizing this is a problem. It's brought two different organizations, Everytown for Gun Safety and the Community Justice Action Fund, which is focused on minoritized communities. And it's saying, look, this is a federal issue. We need to work together, and it doesn't sit within law enforcement necessarily. It's not just a security issue. Like, what can we do to work across sectors to prevent it from happening? So I think that is huge progress,
Mm.
that this has been recently created. I think the other things is talking about it, normalizing these discussions. There's a recent New England Journal of Medicine article that says, hey, we talk about fruits and vegetables, but we ignore the number one killer of children. And it's
Mm.
true. you
Yeah.
know we need to talk about it, and we need to listen. The way we handle firearms in New York City, or think about it, may be different in rural America, but we
Right.
need to talk about it. It is not. There is a political component, but there's a health component, and children are dying, and
Yeah.
it's unacceptable to me that children are dying, and we are not talking about it enough.
Right. And so here we are, and we're talking, and I really appreciate this discussion, because hopefully it will promote more and more discussions, and that's the work you're doing, and I understand that. That's the whole point of what we're trying to do on the podcast, is stimulate discussions, open dialogues with information, and saying, okay, we're not taking sides. Let's all try to solve this problem, agree that there's a problem here, which is what you've done with your research and ongoing. Here's the problem. here's the scope of the problem, here's the details of the problem, and we need some support and backup. I think you're saying you're optimistic because we're starting to break through that roadblock of funds and stuff, and focus that was kind of for the past 2 decades literally taken away from us, handcuffed the ability to look at what the scope of the problem is so we can have the discussion in a evidence-based way. You're optimistic because in 2023 now, the current administration has created this new forum to do this and focus on this, not through the NIH, not through the CDC, but created its own forum and own platform for this, which is definitely optimistic, and having this discussion. So what can people do to push through that, not to look in the past, not to feel despair, not to feel it's overwhelming, but in addition to, joining us in this discussion, what do you think, individuals can do, whether it be a clinician that you've worked with, and you want to give them some advice on how to deal with some children, or if it's a parent or a community member, what are some of the things you would say that we can all start to do to address this gun violence issue in our own lives, with children specifically at this point?
Right, right. Well, one thing is we can be hopeful that
Mm,
there are solutions and there is a path forward. I think people often feel hopeless. I think the other thing is to know that most people are in the middle about this. I think we can, we talk about gun rights, gun owners, and then the other side. You know, I, the more I talk to people, the more I realize we're in the middle, and
mm,
we all want kids to be safe when they go to school. We all want kids to be safe in their homes. So the other thing is what are the tangible things that you can do, in your everyday? Well, if it's a young child, think about safe storage. If you have a firearm, make sure it's secure, that it's locked, unloaded with the ammunition in a separate place. When your child goes to somebody else's home, ask about it. Just like if, there is a pool and your child couldn't swim, or they're serving nuts and your child was
mm.
allergic. It's a health issue. You just want to make sure your kid's safe. Again, it's normalizing these conversations, not to be afraid. The other thing is, we're concerned about school shootings. That does represent a small percentage of gun violence, but the fear is there, right? Children are in fear, and the answer is not bulletproof backpacks. The answer is not more lockdown drills. The answer is not to fight off a shooter. We have to think about ways that we can prevent gun violence in the schools, preventative measures. So I think it's really important for parents of power to speak up and to say, look, lockdown drills may be traumatizing to my child, or, what are ways that we can keep our community safer? The other is to link up with existing groups. Moms Demand Action is wonderful. There are Moms Demand Action chapters everywhere. They're very well informed. Every Town for Gun Safety is a link to Moms Demand Action. Get to know the laws in your state.
Mm.
Safe storage, red flag laws. Again, I think it's like educating yourself, and I think the more you educate yourself, you realize what I can raise awareness about. That look, we have laws out there. We need to use them. Like in New York State, we have a red flag law, but it's underutilized.
Mm.
So one of my tasks is to raise awareness about it. And I guess, and just to realize if it didn't happen to you, it doesn't mean that you don't do anything about it.
Mm.
Um, and people might, Black children are disproportionately affected. It doesn't mean that you don't do something about it. And I think of children as our children and
Mm.
our responsibility. So I think we need to look at it, the community, it's sort of like it takes a village, we've heard,
Yeah.
right? And I truly believe we need to do that for our children. They deserve it.
And I think as a pediatrician myself, and through your work, I think that's very important. A lot of the issues we face is when we're afraid, the pandemic, gun violence, things like that. We tend to recoil back into our shells, into our homes, and focus on our own, so to speak, and the empathy level drops in terms of what's going on in our communities around us. And that only exacerbates the situation. Um, One of the answers being, I think I'm very glad you brought that up. It's a very important issue. And all the things we deal with health in this country is to work on the empathy side of things, to realize that maybe one of the best thing we can do is get involved and start seeing our children as part of a community in their schools, in their friends, in our neighborhoods. And the more we do that, it may be a really good inroad to finding solutions. When we're hiding away from that, either because we're not talking about it or we're literally physically not interacting, we can't even begin to have the dialogues that are necessary. We can't learn, we can't open up, we can't get a sense of what the scope of the problem is. And I think that's an important point you bring up that only exacerbates the problem. It's not uncommon that moms are the ones who say, enough, let's get together. Let's put our heads together and solve this problem. I always say that if women were in charge of a lot of these things, a lot more, we'd probably not have the same degree of problems we have, because as a pediatrician, I can definitely say they're the ones who drive this empathy level. They see that. They see another mother and they go, that could be my child. And I think if we all take that approach, that is my child. Not it could be. It is my child too. There could be a friend of my child. They're part of my neighborhood. That child is part of our community, and anything I can do to help them will help my child and all of us. I think that's a very important point you bring up. And I think it creates some optimism. That's why we love children, right? Because they give us that hope each time. So why not spend the effort there? I think that's very valid.
Yeah, I also, in to add to that, it's, voting, right? Holding legislators accountable, holding ourselves accountable, and holding our lawmakers accountable. Know how they stand on gun laws. Are they, protecting children? And in the American Academy of Pediatrics, they vote kids,
Mm.
and that's how I think about policies and laws and legislators. I'm voting for kids.
Yeah.
So I encourage others to hold their electeds accountable.
So break down the silos. It's not just doctors. It's not just politicians. It's not just moms and family members and gun owners and NRA. It's all of us together, including the NRA, should be working together to create safety in the guns. If we believe in that gun as part of our society, maybe more than others, okay. But we also believe in safety, and these two have to balance out somehow. If we can do this with children, it could impact the rest of us. That's why I think this was an important discussion. And is there anything else you'd like to bring up before I go to our last question? And I really appreciate the time you've spent on a weekend morning here. Our audience should know taking your personal time, and very busy, I know, and working on all this. But anything else you'd like to emphasize?
This violence is health.
Hmm. Yeah. And so when we look at that, I think that leads into the last question very well. On the Pursuit of Health podcast and your work here in gun violence in children, what does that mean? And when you're pursuing health in that issue, what does that mean to you in summary?
It means we need to start early, just like
Mm.
everything else with children. And we need to start prenatally. When mothers are pregnant, how is the violence exposure to mothers affecting their fetus? And what can we do to not have just children survive, but thrive? And that means beginning prenatally.
Yeah, it's a wonderful way of thinking about it. We know that nutritionally now. We know that in so many other ways that the groundwork we lay for our next generation is going to be we'll see the impacts of that. When we look at our own kids, we will want to know, and that's what pediatricians are always asked, how will that affect my kid when they're growing up, when they're an adult? And I think that's what you're asking in your work. How will that affect? Well, as pediatricians, we don't want gun violence to affect them in a negative way. We don't want it here. We realize that there's an impact that is not positive. We want to make it safer and reduce that impact, ultimately eliminate the negative impact of that. And I really appreciate the work you're doing in this. It was something that caught my eye. The timing was very important. We're in a, we're still, it's getting worse, not better. And I really appreciate the fact that there are people like you out there working on this, co-pediatrician, and colleague pediatrician, and spending the time with our audience to discuss this issue. And we'll give them some access to some of the sites that you mentioned. But your advice: get involved. Get involved at your local level, at your school, at your neighborhood level. Learn what your school's policies are. Learn what your community's policies are, your state policies, and become an advocate as a parent. It is part of parenting. It's part of being a pediatrician. And if pediatricians aren't discussing this in their own practices or being part of it, we're ignoring the number one cause of death. That doesn't quite make sense. All of us together need to start talking and acting on this. Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for spending this morning with us. Appreciate it. The best to you in your work and your colleagues. And I thank you. And hopefully in the future, can have you come back and then talk about some of the good things we've learned and the positive directions we're making together. Thank you again.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for having me.
Well, I really believe that this team approach, this idea that in our nation, problems as complicated as gun violence, so specific to us as a people, our own particular form of gun violence, is a problem that is consistently seen as something that's insurmountable, creates a lot of despair, and that we can't solve this problem. But what Dr. Agrawal has told us today is, if we approach this as multifaceted, something that has many causes for it, and admit that and start understanding that through our research, then the answer is for us to all become involved. It is actually not the problem, it's the point. It's complicated because we're a complicated society. So to have any one area of our society try to tackle this all by itself makes no sense. I think that point she made is very, very important. And a lot of the work she's doing, whether it's an impact on children, girl children, and specifically mothers, and ultimately all of us, I think was very important to emphasize that advocacy, all of us doing our small part, is very important. I look forward to having Dr. Agrawal back and following her and her team's approach and the people involved in this area, keeping an eye on the work they're doing, because it will definitely help us all in the future. So I thank her for the time she spent there. And if you all would like to have some contributions to this discussion and comments on this topic or future comments, we can be reached at drfethkemd.com. That's drfethkemd.com. That's our website, or Dr. Fethke MD on Facebook and Instagram. Also coming up, we'd like to make an announcement that this work has culminated and been part of a larger ecosystem, including a book that I've just completed coming out that really deals with a lot of these issues we cover on the podcast. They're basically working together, symbiotic in that sense, and I look forward to having all of our guests have access to that book that's coming out this fall. It's the name of the book is The Privilege of Caring: A Doctor's Urgent Call to Heal the U.S. Healthcare System, and it'll be out in Amazon and Kindle format and in bookstores. So we'll mention more of that in the future, but I'm really excited about that book coming out and how it basically interacts with a lot of things we're doing here on the Pursuit of Health podcast. Well, I'm Dr. Eric Fethke, and really, I hope, believe in my heart as a cardiologist, as a parent, as a member of society, that together we can tackle these problems for our children in the future, such as gun violence. Get out there, become part of your community, work together, make a small change that together can make a big change, because here we all believe that healthcare belongs to everyone. I'm Dr. Eric Fethke, wishing you well in all your pursuits.